And that's all we've got time for. Beep.
Yes. Good evening and welcome to the first of our open talks here at Leicester Gallery. We are super excited to be trying a new format for our talks program, which has been a collaboration between art and design at De Montfort University and Leicester Gallery, also at De Montfort University. So this will be a regular event where we have talks with artists and practitioners and curators and others within the sort of visual arts sector over the next few months. Tonight is a particularly exciting one because it is a celebration of the exhibition that we have in the gallery at the moment, which was produced by the artist Ben Judd, working closely in collaboration with a wide range of different disciplines, and two of his collaborators are with us tonight, Joe Cope and Rod Duncan. So perhaps I'll say a little bit about the genesis of the project and Ben's work to start us off. And I guess the kind of the backbone of tonight's conversation is around ideas of collaboration and processes of collaboration in artistic practice and cross-disciplinary collaboration, which is kind of one of the extraordinary ways Ben has of working with people in quite different areas. So Ben will say more about himself, I'm sure, in a moment, but Ben is an artist that we first worked with at Leicester Gallery as a part of a programme called Fig Futures, in which Art Fund and Outset and Contemporary Art Society all supported a project to create a new piece of work that existed in space for a week, and we worked with Ben on that project, and coming out of that was an acquisition of a piece which led us to the idea of building towards an exhibition which was more substantial than a week and allowed us to explore what Ben's performance could look like in a collection. The process took a little longer than was expected. I think people can have a guess why over the last couple of years. But after some delays, we built the exhibition to open on September the 17th this year with a performance. And the work talks to a kind of a history of community, a fictional community, a history of a fictional community rooted to the site that now is occupied by De Montfort University, and it was framed by the particular histories of Leicester around textiles industries, around histories of migration, but also shaped by work with collaborators to look at ways that it could be presented. And those collaborations are both institutional in terms of working with collections and individual in terms of working with other practitioners like Joe and Rod. So I'll let Ben in a second talk a little bit more about himself. I should say, Joe, I also have a long history of working with. Joe's probably been more involved in more exhibitions in this gallery than any other individual.
Thanks, Hugo.
No, it's great.
I should
it's
say
good.
thank you.
And so Joe is, and told me to say very clearly, she is not a fashion designer. So we're trying to think about, Joe has a practice which is kind of rooted in a conceptual approach to fashion, I think that's fair to say. Mm-hmm. And sort of really deconstructs our assumptions about what fashion is, how it works, wearability, and how it can be read. And so Jo, again, will probably say a few more words about herself and I'll pass across to her. But she's also a member of staff within DMU in the fashion department. Mm-hmm. And for this project, and in fact the previous iteration in 2018 through Fig Futures, Jo worked with Ben on the production of costumes for the performance, which we can now see hanging behind us. And Rod is an author, a writer, based in Leicester, who has produced a series of works looking at kind of, would you use the term counter-histories? Is that
counterfactual history? Yeah, you could say that. Sure.
So kind of counterfactual histories or alternative histories of Leicester, and a Leicester divided from north and south in his, I guess, the best known trilogy, the Gaslight trilogy, in which Leicester forms a kind of the centre line between two very different worlds, north and south, in England, in this counterfactual. So the project had many other collaborators, and those processes have been incredibly exciting to kind of watch them develop. I'm also, because I've said a few words about you guys, before I leap in to let you guys continue, I'll just say a couple of words about myself. So I'm Hugo Worthy, and I'm the arts curator here at Leicester Gallery. So I kind of oversee the programming here, and it's one of the great pleasures is working directly with artists to see the work progress and develop. And I think because we started in 2000, did we start 2017 or 2000? It would have been 2017.
I think it was 2017. Yeah.
On the first iteration of Big Futures. This has been a really long-running, really beautiful project. Watching it kind of pick up pace and change and mutate over time. So that's one of the kind of the real joys of the role is seeing how something goes from an idea on paper to something realised in a space. I'll be involved in kind of the on-running programming of these open talks, and we would be super pleased to see as many of you as possible there for future iterations of this. The way we set it up is for some of them they will be online completely, for some of them there will be a live element like this and a small invited audience, and tickets will be available through the website, and for students it's distributed directly to you, I believe, but Lala can confirm on that. I think she's online at the moment. If you guys have questions, if that's okay with you, Nisha, if there are questions that come up in the chat during the conversation, if you let us know, and we'll be able to answer them as we go along. Otherwise, there's time at the end, lots of time at the end for questions. I'd imagine we'll talk for probably about an hour and a quarter maybe. I'd say there's a good chunk of time for questions after that. So on that, perhaps I'll pass across to Ben, maybe to talk a little bit about the practice, and particularly the practice that's led us here today.
Sure, thanks Hugo. Not sure exactly where to start, but I suppose this particular project is part of in a way I see it as part of a series of projects that maybe culminated, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, when I, prior to this, I've been working really largely with more ephemeral media, so using performance and moving image. And it's only relatively recently that I've worked directly with collections and sort of more physical, permanent manifestations of an idea. And I think as Hugo mentioned in the introduction, I've got a long-standing interest. There's an exploration in the practice around ideas to do with community and the way in which we relate to each other and form groups. Something I think about a lot is how we're all connected to each other in different ways, that we're all connected to family groups or social groups, but we're also individuals, and how we navigate that position, which for me I think is a state of flux of being connected and disconnected. So a sense of being sort of close and separate, or together and apart, is something that I'm continually thinking about within the practice. And so, as Hugo mentioned, there was the invitation to put on an exhibition here in 2018 and develop that for this project. And it's been a fascinating process for me in terms of the research. So my practice is very research heavy, involves a lot of time spent in the place where the exhibition is going to take place. Whether that is in a gallery space, a contemporary gallery space, contemporary art space like this, or I've I did a show quite recently at the Victoria Gallery and Museum in Liverpool, which is in a way, the complete antithesis to this, a extremely ornate Victorian building. And I've done lots of other works that are not in a gallery at all, that are outside in different spaces. So that process of exploration is particularly important, and thinking about the history of the site itself and the history of the city. And I've been, again, as Hugo mentioned, imagining a group who may have inhabited this site at some point in the past. And I think at the very beginning of imagining this group, I've got a very rough sense, a very vague sense of who they might be or what they might look like. And so there's a sort of an outline or a sketch in my mind. And then I think part of the pleasure for me is finding things that might evidence their existence. So that could be some of the artifacts that you might see here in the exhibition, which are from the Leicester Museum collections. And the previous exhibition, they were from other collections within the city, but some of them, most of them, I think, were excavated locally. Some of them in the past have been fabrications of originals. In this case, they're all original artifacts. But also thinking about the group and what they might look like, how they might present themselves visually, how they might move through a space, how they might occupy a space, what they might say to each other, what they might sound like, and how all of these different elements might gradually sort of coalesce and come together to form this group. So the performance that took place here on the 17th of September was a way of imagining this group maybe re-emerging and reoccupying this space. So it's a way of thinking of sort of embodying the group. So just to come back to Hugo's earlier mention of collaboration, and just thinking about that as another way of developing a group or developing a community. So I suppose on the one hand there's a fictional group, and imagining that and how they might exist in the world. Where that world is a moot point that we could maybe come to, whether it's the here and now or it's somewhere else, some other time. But there's also a kind of a more physical group, a more physical sense of people joining up and togetherness. And I think that really does, for me, increasingly come through a process of collaboration. So, for example, working with Joe and working with Rod is a way of forming a link between people, or links between people. As we were talking about earlier, sometimes those links are very direct, sometimes they're indirect. You know, Joe and Rod know each other really just through this project. So yeah, that sense of how the group identity might develop is really interesting for me, that it's both through this sort of imagining process, but it's through a very sort of real encounter with other people in the world as well. Maybe I'll pause there and hand over.
I was going to say, so I'm going to hand over to Jen. I think there's something really worth drawing out from that, which we'll come back to, is that there's this really interesting parallel between the process of kind of articulating a fictional community and what is quite clearly building a community around the project, a community of practitioners, a community of participants, a community of attendees, but particularly the kind of practitioners. As you say, they come to know each other through you, and that's quite a powerful outcome from the kind of the project.
Very much so, and also this, I think, a sense of we were talking also earlier about the sort of power of the unknown. I think in terms of creative practice, and that's particularly important for me in relation to collaboration. I think and a sense that I might have an idea of something, but where it ends up is maybe different to how I imagined it. And that's partly, or even quite largely, through that collaborative process, I think, and through discussion, and through really encouraging a sense of agency in terms of collaborators and what they might do with something, what they might do with an initial suggestion, and where they might go with it.
Yeah, and I actually find that really interesting in Ben's practice, is kind of how do you keep that level of hold and control on the participants and your vision and all of those things. So, that's probably something we can discuss. So my long-standing relationship originally is with Hugo, and Hugo first exhibited my work in like 2009, something like that. 1970. I guess Hugo's part of my development as an artist. So that's a really lovely long-standing relationship that's not just existed on this site. And I think often you introduce and kind of see the people that you have relationships with and then make those connections. I have quite a rebel practice, so as Hugo really, sort of described already very clearly, I'm from a fashion background, but I'm always rebelling against fashion. So I'm asking questions of fashion, as we should of art or any practice, what really is art or what really is fashion. And the past work I've done with performance, some of the things, there's lots of tensions in the work. So in terms of things like costume, I would say to Ben, I don't like the word costume, or I don't want to think about this as fashion, but I'm interested in just questioning everything, the relationship to the cloth and the body, the relationship to the cloth and the space, how something might transform and become something that's more of an installation. I think our engagement with the object, and I think I created some work for, it was a one-off event, a material movement gala for Sadler's Wells a number of years ago. And in that, the thing that I was challenging was, is the garment or is the fashion element a prop? And in my mind, it's not. The garment or the piece that I create on the body is the actual performance. So it's kind of like that object has all the metaphors, all the narrative, all the symbolism in it, and the performance is there to bring it to life. So that's really interesting when I'm working on a project like that, is because all of these elements of which, when you're collaborating, it's kind of how far you go with what your point of view is and how far you go as a collaborative entity. And so I think it's about retaining elements of your core practice and what you believe is true to what you do, while being really cooperative with understanding the artist and understanding Ben's perception of what these clothes should be. And, so there's a real kind of, there has to be lots of give and take and lots of understanding. It's certainly got no room for individuals to push their idea fully, but you have to retain the sense of self. So I think that's really important. So
can I just pick up on something with you, Jane, before I hand across to Rod, which was, and I think it's really interesting in this context, is about making. And for you, your artisanal approach to leather is phenomenal. That process of making is really key to you. So I'm really interested in that kind of layering from the actual, the night, no, not the night before, the night of the performance, kind of stitching costume together through to that kind of like producer role that you kind of, by the time we get to that point, that you inhabit, Ben, I think.
Yes. Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
So I think it was really saying to James, kind of like to start with.
Lots of it's conceptualisation, isn't it? And then eventually it becomes something tangible.
But for you, that process of making is a really kind of key, lasting level.
Craft.
The craft.
Yeah.
But a very traditional kind of model of craft that's really quite key in your practice, I think.
Yeah, I think. So I do work a lot with leather, and I'll sometimes spend, I've just spent about a year crafting an installation that's literally like very much about hand process, but embedding lots of emotional content, and again, lots of metaphors and symbolism, which is definitely in this piece as well. But yeah, I think the making process, really came in the latter stages. I think that a lot of it was conversations and conceptualizing what these garments were. And then it became about manifesting it and really thinking through materials, like the way we gathered materials, the way we chose them. And then the act, we actually sat, didn't we, outside your office, sort of actually talking and stitching and, yeah, creating. And yeah, I guess, yeah, the craft I don't think was really laboured for this one, but definitely the sense of craft and the things that we chose. So you'll find that some of the things have got past craft in them. You'll see that there's some pieces that are remnants of things like tapestries. So somebody has dedicated and put hours of time into those, and then we've kind of borrowed them, a bit like, you know, Ben's artifacts, where he's, you know, you've sourced an artifact and then kind of, I guess, yeah, deposited it onto something else, recontextualise it. Yeah, you can give me the better language tonight, Hugo. Thank you for that. Deposited on the dropped on the garment.
I got the deposit. And on that note, yeah, Rod, could you tell us a little bit about your kind of practice? I think there's something really interesting, isn't there, about that idea of kind of alternative histories. And there's something here about the way Ben finds through practitioners and through objects materials which are then kind of reframed and represented to create new narratives. And actually that idea of kind of alternative histories fits into that. You're taking material that exists and kind of reworking it.
Yeah, I've never done anything quite like this before. I tend to work with long fiction, and so that's novels or occasionally short stories and screenplays, and those are forms in which, generally speaking, you try to make things clear and explicit, and you know, lay out the boundaries so that your audience gets to understand, you know, all the exposition you're giving them, and they understand when and where and all that sort of stuff. And so when Ben invited me to fabricate some sort of alternate history as a background for this community, I naturally just went to the same practice, and I sort of came back with a document which laid out dates and, you know, times, and in this era this happened, in this era this happened. And I was quite pleased with it, to be frank. But, but Ben said, well, can you take out all that specific stuff? Because I want it to be rather more open-ended. And so I thought, well, how do I possibly do that? Because the tools of my trade are giving specifics that then conjure in the mind of the audience, in the mind of the reader, a whole world. So if I say that someone's sitting on the beach and the sun's shining and some sailing boats are sailing around on the water, that's one version. Or I could say there's a beach and the sun's shining and 3 sailing boats are sailing on the water. And generally speaking, that will conjure or crystallize for the audience a much more specific, clear image in the mind. So all my practice is about that blending of the generalized and the specific in order to create something very immersive and tangible. But with the direction from Ben, I found myself saying, okay, I can't do this. I've got to sort of change the gaze a little bit to use different specifics, perhaps inconsequential specifics that will not give away too many clues about the where and the when and all this sort of stuff. And I think all through our interactions, and I've got so much out of the process, I have to say. Thank you, Hugo, for introducing us, and thank you, Ben, for the opportunity, because I got so much out of that creative tension between you pulling in one direction and me pulling in the other direction, and eventually that giving rise to this idea of a community of weavers, effectively, who used weaving as a symbol for the binding of a community and for mending problems in the community. and all the way that we work that through. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question you asked.
You are 100%. It absolutely gives some kind of context around your writing and how it feeds into a project like this. I guess I'm really interested in the way that you create these, or you broker these relationships between people, between yourself and other collaborators. I'm really excited by the prospect that it's absolutely a two-way experience. The collaborators are impacted, the way they think is changed, as well as the way the exhibition develops. But I'm then really interested in kind of how it scales. So, well, not scales is perhaps the wrong word, but how it translates from what you were talking about, Joe. These conversations which are about brokering relationships are translated eventually into material form. And maybe to talk a bit about that process, and you talk about that kind of the unknownness of it. And I don't think you've used the word risk, but the risk that's there, that potentially Rod could stand by writing a novel. Yes. And that's where you get.
It was a close thing.
I think I might just need to let someone in. But, sorry, Steve, you can't.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Get me in trouble tonight, are we?
This is a classic moment in airtime meeting where the security guard busts in.
We're going to get kicked out.
Yeah, tells us we've all got to go.
Well, that would be a creative space.
Yeah, definitely.
Back again.
Yeah.
Live TV, right? Yeah, so kind of how you experience that process, and I think it's worth mentioning perhaps the project in Kingston, because there are such strong parallels between the project in Kingston and the project here.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, the project in Kingston is which is just drawn to a close. It is a fellowship, the Stanley Picker Fellowship in Art and Design, which is attached to Kingston University, London, and that was a sort of a 2-year project that developed in parallel with this one. And there are various similarities between the two. But your question was really about the sort of how do we shift from these conversations to the things that we then encounter in the space. And I suppose it happens in different ways with different collaborators. As Rod said, with his contribution. It was the writing. So there are very distinct, very direct ways, in fact, that it then feeds into the work. That Rod for this iteration, Rod produced a piece of text around this group which Rod named the Wayfarers, and as he mentioned, that was about that was sort of focused on this method of weaving as a way of binding. In the version we did in 2018, quite literally binding themselves together as a sort of a method of healing. And by the way, it was really interesting that this iteration developed during the height of Brexit, before Brexit actually took place, but when it was very much a headline pre-pandemic. So as soon as the pandemic struck, Brexit and lots of other things became less important somehow. But then I think it was on everyone's minds in a very big way. I think through our conversations, thinking very much about this sense of division, the deep-rooted sense of division and a split that was occurring, or seemed to be occurring here. And sort of imagining how this group might develop from a group in 2018 that was all about togetherness and bringing people together, and what happens if there's a split within this group. And then Rob thought about these two versions of the group as being the watchers and the makers, and how they might function quite differently. So some of that writing, which was both descriptive prose, but then also more poetic verse, became directly used in the performance in other words, the singers actually sung it as a verse, not word for word, but again, another collaborator who was based in Athens, called Apostolis, is a composer, and he sort of took fragments of this text and composed song, which you might be able to hear in the background. So in some ways, that very sort of direct way of it becoming the fabric of the exhibition or of the performance. But in other ways, it's more nuanced than that, I think. And there was a lot of it was actually was through the very fact that we had conversations with both of you, helped my thinking very profoundly. And I think that's one of the great pleasures I get from collaborating, is that I feel like I'm learning a lot all the time. So I'm learning about all kinds of things. I suppose there are processes that you both methodologies that you both use that are quite different to my own, and that's a really interesting thing for me to think about. So I think it's through the conversations, and it's through just getting a sort of a wider sense, feeling out a wider sense of this group and who they might be. We were using the metaphor earlier, weren't we, of a jigsaw puzzle, and just I sort of see at the beginning of a project everything being extremely fragmented, and there are these different elements that I know I'm interested in. How they're all going to fit together, I don't know, and that's a mystery and a real pleasure, I think, in seeing them gradually come together in a form that I hadn't quite imagined at the beginning, I suppose. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely answers the question. And I guess for me, what I'm thinking while you're talking about this is how unique it is as a form of visual arts practice, which is then going to lead me to the question: how unique is it as a form of visual arts practice? I can't think of any other practitioners who work in at such a production level. And I was trying to think: are there practitioners that you're aware of, or have worked with even, who have similar models of practice? Because there's such a theatricality to it, not just in terms of kind of the presentation, the performative element, but the process situates in that world. But of course, it's absolutely of the visual arts world, it's absolutely of galleries. But the process itself, I'm genuinely curious as to whether or not there are other practitioners that you're aware of who have that kind of production process that you have.
Well, it's hard to know. There may be. It's hard to know because you only ever see the finished result. And I mean, you could read about their practice and listen to interviews, but it's difficult to know what happens in the run-up or the build-up to something. But I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question.
But so just genuinely, so for me, I think kind of I can't think of anyone. That idea of a unique model of practice is really interesting. That actually, how we talk to some of that seems to me really exciting as visual artists, as kind of creatives. That it's about a really complicated nurturing of relationships, nurturing of, and also kind of perhaps mentoring is the wrong word, but that bringing people into your world and your thinking and kind of supporting that process, negotiating that process. But this is happening with lots of people concurrently to create this kind of extraordinary material outcome. And that's a really ambitious methodology for production. And this is casting no shade on painters, but compared to a process where you engage very directly with a singular object. And I think actually there's still kind of within the art sector perhaps a dependency on that relationship to the object, and what's created is kind of a set of experiences. So one of the conversations we had, which I think was significant, is actually that the way this space functions, and for those of you online who haven't had a chance to see it, it's up until the 21st. It's definitely worth coming in to see it. It's a really beautiful kind of reworking of the space. but Ben had suggested that we can kind of reset it as part of the process of it being in space, that kind of curtains can come and flow, and that it's not a static environment. There are elements, there are points within the layout which are static, but actually it can be reworked in different ways. And so that kind of, the space, the exhibition itself becomes performed. And performed without you, again, it becomes a risk. It's kind of like, it's a albeit a much simpler collaboration than the one with Rod and Joe, but a collaboration that we hopefully will hang it in, put the curtains in a way that works effectively. So I'm kind of talking around this kind of very sustained level of collaboration and the depth of it. And then I guess I'm going to come to this idea of you have collaborators that you work with across projects. So the composer and choreographers that you've worked with, have worked across locations and across different contexts. I'm really interested in that relationship as well, and how that relates to these kind of localized collaborative experiences.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, we were talking about Dionysius Tsophidis, and I'm mispronouncing his surname accidentally, but he's got a Greek surname that I'm very bad at pronouncing. Is a choreographer based in Athens, and Apostolis Sivaramis, which I've also probably mispronounced that, so apologies if you're listening. They're both they're both people I've worked with for a number of years. Dionysius in particular for well over 10 years now, and we worked together on a performance that I was commissioned to do at the Swedenborg Society in London, and we just built up an understanding and a way of working with each other. So there's a familiarity there that feels very instant, and develops in a really interesting way over time. But it's very interesting, isn't it? But especially now, they weren't able to travel here because of the pandemic, so they were literally beamed in via Zoom. Even during the rehearsals,
like we're doing right now.
yeah, and so that idea of this very sort of local collaboration with Joe and Rod, which is very much embedded in the city and and different communities within the city, and they are based in Athens, and Dionysius did come here in 2018. But essentially they're separated from it. So I mean, in a way that feels exciting actually, to have that diversity and that sort of that richness of different approaches. And the ultimate is really for them, for everybody to be here in person and to do it physically.
Those days are gone.
Those days are gone.
At least for a while.
Yeah. But it makes sense for me to sort of continue different collaborations over time, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about collaboration, is in terms of both scale, both temporal, kind of like across time, but actually that idea of someone collaborating who has no direct relationship to the context, and then people who have very close relationships to the context of the city. So I'm going to ask Joe and you. Actually, I'm going to ask you first, Rod, and then I'm going to ask you, Joe, because I know them. About, is this your first experience of kind of collaborative process, or is this something you've done before?
I've collaborated particularly with filmmaking.
Okay.
That's an intensely collaborative process, but novelists tend to work pretty much alone until their work goes through the editorial process. It's certainly my first work in this arena of contemporary art, and so yeah, it was new. I think that a couple of things strike me from it. One is Ben's understanding of and ability to create an environment where people can be creative, and that's a great skill, and it's not a passive thing. It's a very ongoing, very nurturing thing. And the other is the respect given to the collaborators. That I sometimes looking in from the outside on the world of contemporary art, I see there's a relationship between the artist and the maker sometimes. And there was never the sense here of a difference in status. Obviously, Ben is the artist at the centre of this, but we're all the people in this orbit are collaborators, and that word collaborator seems incredibly important here, and I think that is very distinctive and very timely. I think that's because all the people involved are developed and changed as we go through it, just as hopefully the audience is, and it just seems like a wonderful process.
It's interesting you talking about that, the process of writing as being very solitary, and I was thinking about that in relation to, surprisingly, or maybe it's not surprising, but a lot of my practice is also solitary and is studio based. And I've had a studio for a long time and have never been able to share it with anybody, or at least not for the last 20 years or so. And absolutely value that sort of silence and space to think and make. But there's something also then about getting out of there and leaving the studio and having conversations and collaborating that then reinvigorates that studio practice.
Yeah.
So I think the relationship between solitary and the opposite of that is important.
And I think that's my experience with writing as well, that whenever I've done collaborative work, it's always enriched the other elements of my practice. So, yeah.
I'm going to head to you in a sec, Joe, but I think really interestingly for me, maybe that's when I was talking about that kind of artisanal experience of kind of like I don't know if this is even accurate, but kind of that's how I imagine lasting the leather. But the writing, that's fundamentally a solitary kind of process, isn't it? So for you, the writing, for you, this kind of like process of deep craft and a process of research for you, Ben. And these are the kind of the things that sit behind then that network of kind of collaboration. But I was going to come back to you then, Joe, in terms of I know that you have quite a collaborative practice, so it'd be interesting to talk about kind of your history within that and how it has kind of worked then.
I think I mirror some of the same things in terms of, I think you need that intensive time when you're on your own and so for me it would be thinking through making and having that complete still that you talk about, and I've never shared a studio, I've resisted that, I think we have those, we sort of want that personal space where we can really fixate on the development of our thoughts and our practice, and maybe that's the thing about our personalities as well. I used to view collaboration as polluting a practice rather than sometimes,
there's a PhD there, collaboration as pollution.
In terms of sometimes you can water something down, and I kind of think there's this strength in sometimes being obsessive and kind of uncooperative and uncollaborative, and I love that side as well. So the opposite of that is challenging it and going, how do we do this and end up with something that's greater? I think that one of the things that I do over the last couple of years, I ask myself, like, okay, my practice is important to me. I believe I'm making beautiful work that should be seen. It's about, it's like a lot of artists, it emulates from the self, it's kind of exorcism of the self and all of those things. So there's a lot of things that are about, the artist. But I started saying, well, does any of the things I'm doing really matter to the wider world? Like what is the bigger picture? So it was this kind of like greater than myself realization, which I think all artists have to have at some point. And just, does my practice matter to anyone, and why would it touch anybody, and what's the bigger picture? And that's when I started working with shelter and working with more fashion as a social cause, and thinking about working with kind of the homeless. And a project I was doing for London Craft Week was getting 10 designers and artists and pairing them with people who had been previously homeless. And that again was a really interesting way of collaborating in a completely different sense. But yeah, I think one of the things that happened during this project was, so Roma who may be online, who collaborate on all of the wonderful textiles side of things, was somebody who just contacted me and said, I'd like to do some work experience with you. And I'm like, I only work alone in my studio, couldn't possibly have anybody in there. And then at the same time, there was Ben's project, and I thought she could be a really wonderful match for Ben's holistic approach and drawing people in. So me and Ben had this meeting with her, and we both kind of went, yeah, something feels good, something feels right. And she feels like somebody who could form part of this community in the way, you know, that Ben's practice works. And I love the fact that your practice is so open that it can take on those other entities and fully allow them to realise something for themselves. So I think that was really, that was really lovely. And also that in terms of hierarchical systems within collaboration, of course, you know, Ben is the artist, it's Ben's work, and there's always that respect for it's 100% Ben's work. But within the collaborations, everybody is equal. And so Roma, who was a CSM recent graduate from textiles, she became like this equal partner whose voice, you know, when we had three-way meetings, her voice was equal, her contribution was equal. And I really like that idea. I really like that equality within the collaborative process.
In fact, her role grew.
Yeah, massively. Developed, yeah.
To do these incredible 8 meters, is it 8 meters high?
Yeah. 8 meters by 6 meters.
8 meters by 6 meters textiles. And that wasn't part of the original agreement at all. You know, she was originally going to be your assistant to help with the costumes, and then it sort of.
But she showed herself as somebody who could equally collaborate. So it was like, well, why would you not do that? Her mum even became a collaborator. Her mum started sourcing them, had sourced all of these materials. She was like a bit of a magpie, and she'd been sourcing things for years. And her husband had always said to her, you know, why are you collecting all this stuff? Like, he's never going to do anything with it. And he wanted her to like throw it out in the tip. And then she had her moment.
Sounds pretty familiar.
And it was like, so then her mum suddenly became this person who we were sourcing material from. And I love that extension, the family that you talked about, you know, the human relationships, the fact that anybody at any point could, if it fits or if it's right, could become a participating member of this community. I think that's lovely. Yeah. And obviously with our relationship was from I'm interested in kind of whether Ben has this order of how he works with people, and whether you always know, right, you know, I speak to Rod first and then that's that order, and then speak to this person next. But what was really interesting about both times I've worked with you, we see Rod's text very abstractly as words, and then we ask you lots of questions like, does it mean this? What's the cloth of gold? So there was this time it's all about the cloth of gold. So what is that cloth of gold and how important is it? And is that about hierarchy? And is that person meant to be elevated? And when did that? And we're asking you, and Ben will be like, you don't answer any of those questions purposely. You sometimes give us some answers, or sometimes you'll kind of. I
probably don't know the answer.
Yeah. So I love that ambiguity of kind of you've got this text. No one knows the answers. No one knows what the truth is of it. There is no real truth you're finding your own truth in it, but it's a journey and it has no conclusive end, or it's not rational at all. And you kind of always have those wry smiles, or kind of like, you know, and it's kind of like, well, you know, you may ask all these questions, but, you know, and I think that's always, I've never had something where I've had to navigate something where there's people, you aren't fighting for something more solid and conclusive, I guess. But yeah, so that's interesting.
Yeah,
that's fascinating to hear your experience there.
We
can compare it. Yeah.
It's not dissimilar from yours.
No, absolutely. And that ambiguity was what we were working with. We were giving, I suppose, the eventual audience, but also the collaborators, a puzzle that doesn't have an answer.
Exactly.
That has a value. To carry a puzzle like that has its own value.
Yeah. So exactly. So we're talking about collaboration. We're also talking about participation, aren't we? And the role that the audience has, or the viewer has within that experience. And so to make this a sort of an immersive experience through the gallery in which the audience are implicated in something. And I think that was one of the reasons why I wanted to divide the space up in this way. Going back to what I was saying about the conversations Rod and I had about division, that there were five dancers in the performance and 10 singers, I think. So they were separated in these 5 spaces in the gallery. So you can see at the moment the curtains are open, but at the beginning of the performance they were all closed. So there was a distinct sense of separation. The audience were free to wander between them, or they may have even sort of become trapped in one of these cubicles at some point anyway. And then the curtains opened at a particular point in the performance to open the space up. And the audience again could move freely through the space. And then the curtains closed again towards the end of the performance. And we should mention also there's another part of the gallery space you can't see on the camera, which is sort of a back space, which is also curtained off, but the curtains opened. The performers and the audience went in. There was no sort of directive necessarily for the audience to move into that back space, but again, feeling that they are part of a group ultimately, and that it's inevitable that they will go back there. And we should probably mention the magic lantern that took place.
I think it's definitely worth mentioning the magic lantern. We'll come to that because I just wanted to say this also. So there's this narrative of collaboration in terms of in terms of practitioners, but it also, for me, actually, there's a narrative of administrative collaboration as well with organisations like the museum. But I'm quite interested in kind of how those relate. But I think, interestingly, in lots of ways, the magic lantern kind of sits somewhere between those two worlds, I think. Like, it's super creative, but also it's quite a logistical undertaking. It
is, yeah. I've been interested in magic lantern projections for a long time, and magic lantern shows, which have their own sort of historical interest for me. But I think particularly because they suggest a sense of awe and wonder, and a way in which that might sort of bring people together through the experience of not only looking at something but participating in something. And I think there's something about the analogue that does that in a way that's very different to the digital. And there's something about knowing that they're called magic lanterns, but actually they're just a box with a light shining through a slide. It's very simple, and I think we understand the analogue, we can understand how it functions, and I think because of that, I personally am even more amazed by the result. So there's a sense of genuine sort of magic about seeing these images produced. So that sort of operated in the sort of centre points of the performance, really. There's this darkened space in the back of the gallery that the performers and the audience go into and experience something where a lot of these ideas we've been talking about become realised, I think, and acted out. So there was this sense of the group splitting and coming together again, and other weird and wonderful things.
I noticed that the audience didn't always do as well. Like that thing, I don't know how you feel about this, but you can't control collaboration, you can't control audiences always, and they, in the sense that I remember the magic lantern guy went, they all stood on that side and I wanted them to stand on this side, or so the first time they came through they were like the sun or the moon was like floating across people's faces, which was actually really nice to watch, but they couldn't see the magic lantern. And then the next one, it was kind of, how do we usher them over there, or how do they, and they naturally ended up on the other side. And then so there's that element of control again, isn't it, of like, you know, people will inhabit space in ways that I think, you know, people often want to be told what to do. So I think it's quite interesting when they're not. Like, you know, it's always really uncomfortable, isn't it? You're in a space, you're waiting for someone to take the lead. And I think that thing of like, I don't know whether you find that uncomfortable yourself, and you go when that's happening, and you're kind of going, oh, you know, you didn't really direct them, you kind of let them.
But really interesting, we had quite a lot of conversations actually, specifically about that and exactly what level of prompt was needed for us. So just opening the curtain was enough to kind of push people through. And we had people, including Nisha over there, on the standby to lead people through if required. So there was kind of a set of backup plans.
Yeah.
So interestingly, because it feels, but we hadn't had the conversation about which side of the room to go on, because it hadn't crossed our mind at that point. And then it was really interesting because they did stand in, they took both sides of the room, because that made sense. But then of course they couldn't see part of the performance.
They became part of the performance, didn't they?
Yeah. But I think I'm going to ask a question, because this is a really important question for us at the gallery. So Leicester Gallery, our big area of interest is around performance and collecting performance. It's really exciting to see that as a core part of kind of visual arts production in the 21st century. I mean, it has been for years, but kind of in the way it's collected. Then, for me, this is extraordinary pathos to the idea of this kind of amazing event on the 17th of September that on a global scale, a handful of people are able to access. And so I'm interested in liveness and the way we think about it and record it and represent it. And for me, with both a professional and a kind of institutional interest in this, how it gets represented, what happens to something like that in the future. We have a film, and the film's beautiful, but it's profoundly different as an experience to being there on the night. It was really, the film is moving, and the music is, but it's not the same as being there. And how we think about live events in terms of access and longevity, maybe.
Yes, I mean, lots of interesting questions there around the nature of documentation, and is it purely to record, or does the documentation then become a standalone work in its own right? And I've been working a lot with different filmmakers to try and sort of capture different elements of that liveness. And you're right, it cannot be reproduced, but I think that it can become its own work ultimately. And yes, it's. I mean, I think the fact that only a relatively small number of people experience it live. I produced a performance for Whitstable Biennale on a boat a few years ago, and if you take away the crew and the performers and the camera operator, there were only 5 people were allowed on the boat. We did a couple of versions of it, a few trips, but still it felt sort of very exclusive.
That was sort of the word I was avoiding, but actually it's a part of it, isn't it? It's kind of like being at the first Sex Pistols gig or something. There's a magic to being there, and part of that is about other people not being there. Yes.
Well, I think that's really interesting, actually, in terms of a sense of separation, isn't it? We've been talking a bit about that, about togetherness and separateness, and going back to the project in Kingston was very much about thinking about islands. And I mentioned the boat at Whitstable. There's also a boat as part of the Kingston project, thinking very much about the boat as island, and a sense of drifting away from the mainstream, of what happens when that separateness occurs, what happens to groups, what happens to the way in which people interact with each other and form relationships with each other, and ideas are generated maybe differently within that context as well. So I suppose thinking about this group as a group that has drifted away from the mainstream, or drifted away through time somehow as well. We're just sort of catching them as on that journey. So that sense of you as an audience member maybe connecting with this group who are here but also not here seems important, I think.
Could I just say that also the sense of installation, I think, is really important to both, like both of the works, in terms of there's almost a performative nature to how we thought about installing things, so that if you came in post-performance, you kind of felt like you did get a sense of where the bodies were or how they interacted with space. I think kind of like that would be the example of that you can almost imagine, did a head go through there? What did they do next? Did they travel through these spaces? So I kind of think that's really unique to, sometimes you do have almost like the debris of the performance and it lasts for a certain amount of time, or you see the aftermath of the performance, but you almost deposits, but you kind of reconstructed and chose how you wanted to stay as an installation that maybe in some way described that a performance had happened or occurred.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a really lovely way of putting it. It leaves us a gap, a space for the viewer to imagine, but then also to insert themselves as one of these. They
can still wonder. Yeah.
And these elements that you can see that are suspended are a really integral part of the costume that is put on during the performance and attaches to the sort of undergarments. And they have a hole in them. So I guess there's a sense of yes, I suppose you as a viewer embodying that person or imagining wearing this costume.
And I think you can hear the sound is still here. There's so many parts, isn't there?
So I don't think I was neither trying to devalue the experience of the exhibition nor the film as a standalone film. I think it's more that the exclusivity of the nature of performance, and we love performance and we kind of support it. So and as you know, we've had this conversation. What I'm interested in is that kind of the possibility of staging the performance again as part of kind of like a process, but I'm really interested in kind of the consequences of that, and also there's something really, that mythologization that starts to take place around performance where we don't have access to kind of like Capral's happenings or something. Probably weren't that exciting if you were actually there, but like retrospectively they sound amazing. So there's something about that. Not the incidental ephemerality of performance, but the deliberate kind of sense of building an experience which has passed. And as you say, absolutely fits into that idea of islands and separation in a really interesting way. My next question is around ideas of modularity within the work. But what you do is to kind of negotiate lots of kind of discrete elements within an exhibition space. And I would say we talk about performance, but also this kind of when you produce work, you produce an exhibition. So I'm interested in the kind of the status of the individual objects, because we had this really interesting conversation, which we just touched on, with Will Welsford, who was the musical director for the project, not the composer, but oversaw the singing, the choir. And he was talking about working with the music as a standalone presentation of the music. And that seemed to me such an interesting kind of question mark about what the relationship is, which I'm talking about now in object terms in the way that you were talking about people and community, what the relationship is between autonomous elements within the project and the kind of the overall exhibition as an artwork. Could we meaningfully hang these extraordinary kind of pieces, the fabric curtains, and talk about it as an element in the work, or does it need the whole shebang to make sense? Shebang's not a technical term.
Very interesting question, and I guess that also relates to the idea of an acquisition, doesn't it?
It relates closely to the idea of acquisition. Yes.
And how a work can then function sort of beyond its original intentions, beyond its first life. What happens to it afterwards? So what happens if you break it down and just show individual elements? I think ideally, I suppose it goes back to that sense of autonomy or agency of an individual collaborator. And what happens to that nugget of creativity?
Yeah.
I think there is the potential for that. I love that idea of just hearing a choir rendition of the song on its own. the unexpectedness of that, and that being out of my control, really, that being something that just has its own life. There were things, going back to the Kingston project, that I experienced. On the boat we had different programmed events, most of which I oversaw, some of which I had almost nothing to do with because they just grew out of other sort of collaborations. And it's a very strange feeling for me, sort of encountering those elements. It makes me feel uncomfortable in a good way, I think. I sort of like that feeling of not knowing exactly how that evolved or where it would lead to.
Can you say just a little bit more about the boat? Because it's a kind of the way your practice works. I guess over the last few years has been to have these working with kind of collections and collaborators to articulate narratives around ideas of community, but then also kind of and the work for Art Night, where you're absolutely building, and the boat, where you're building a platform. Platform is like a really loaded term these days in the world of kind of like online activity, but building an environment which facilitates and supports real world community. And the boat sort of transcended both of those actually, but kind of maybe Art Night was something about building a space for community.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that was a project. Art Night is an annual event in London in which artists are invited or commissioned to respond to site in a particular way. And I developed a series of structures working with an architectural practice that would invite the local community to inhabit this space that was otherwise sort of semi-abandoned within a sort of a housing project. And I've done other things on an island on the River Don in Sheffield, built a temporary structure and invited people to inhabit it for 48 hours. And you're right, the boat is an extension of that. I also worked with interior design students at Kingston University to build a structure both on and inside the boat, so it housed different events in different ways. So yes, I think and ultimately, I suppose then, therefore, you could see this as another way of thinking about a structure or an environment that is a focal point for the group or houses the group in different ways. And again, it's temporary. It lasts longer than some of the other ones that were just 48 hours. Yeah. But it's still there as a place where you can imagine this group existing, I think.
Yeah, so I think for me that's a really interesting idea or way of thinking about this as kind of as a base for a community. And then I guess that reflects the mission of civic space, is to function as a kind of an environment which allows or supports the development of community. So I think then my next question, we mentioned acquisition, kind of modularity, is how does this move forward? So I'm interested, like, is there an end point to a project, a kind of a close to it?
I had a very similar conversation with somebody yesterday about this, and I think the legacy of a project is as important, if not more important, than the project itself in lots of ways. So thinking about and I'm not thinking about this in sort of necessarily in university terms, when universities talk about impact, because that's got a slightly different meaning. But how these conversations might continue, or collaborations might continue, or connections might continue above and beyond the original intentions of the project. So for me, there's not an end point. It's not a finite thing. I think I want it to continue in different ways. Whether it does or not, I don't know, but that's the ambition. Yeah.
So I like that. Maybe there's kind of ripples that go on afterwards. And I think we talked before about this kind of idea of like when we delivered Fig Futures, it wasn't with the expectation that there would be a second kind of iteration of it.
Yeah.
And for you guys, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about kind of how the process or the experience has kind of affected your practices, whether or not it's kind of made absolutely more narrative.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that ripple effect that you're talking about, so with the dancers and the people that we worked with, I was kind of thinking about sort of how I wanted to use performance. I do some performative elements in the work, and how I might want to use performance to understand somebody's culture more. And having re-engaged with those people again, you know, I wouldn't use them all as a collective, because that's kind of part of Ben's practice. It's like I see that as they're yours, kind of in that sense that, you know, I wouldn't take that template and go, oh, I'm going to use all those performers. But I kind of thought, okay, they're from Greece, and, you know, I've re-engaged with some of the people, and I was thinking about, I would love to do a piece of work, and I've kind of got in touch with one of the girls about uncovering some of the past history of Greece and how I can learn and she can learn about something through performance and about her country. So I've started kind of a conversation that's the exact ripple effect that you're talking about, where it's like you've connected with somebody. What does that mean moving forward? I think all the relationships are, you know, so interesting, and sometimes it might be about a direct effect of regrouping and going on. I think the fact that you work across, you know, you're working with Leicester people and people from completely different places, that I find really inspiring. So that was one thing that kind of, you know, I'd started to think about in general.
Interestingly, like specific, tangible, material project, Helga.
Yeah. Actual real thing. So yeah, I think that was interesting. I mean, totally not related, but in terms of like going back to the unexpected, the ambiguity around the whole project, we didn't know who the dancers were, I think, till really close to the time, in terms of would they be able to get here? Yes. Who are they? Are they well? And all of that sort of thing. So I think part of the design process was for me learning to be more flexible. So it was kind of designing costumes or things for the body without having any measurements. So I kept saying to Ben, do we know who it is yet? Do we know who the performers are? Do we know what size they are? Do we know how tall they are? And I quite like that fact that we didn't know, and it was a case of going, okay, what's the maximum chest size for a man that might turn up? So we went for kind of 50 centimetres, I think. We kind of were like, oh, you know, let's factor that in. And then for the women, 40 centimetres, let's go do it around that. So we were working from really, and that created the design. So it's kind of going, the fact we don't know who they are created the design itself. So it's about saying they have to be blocky. That's kind of what happened last time as well. They have to be blocky, but in a different way to last time. And then they have to have maybe things that can be pulled in. So I like the fact of almost like designing from that sort of perspective, which would not be the usual design process. Again, you'd have the intent of who the wearer was. So we knew there was, I mean, that's just another level of the ambiguity, isn't it? That actually manifested itself in the final outcomes.
So before we go on, I was going to suggest, if people have questions online or in real world, please feel free to let us know. I'm not going to do an awkward wait for people to ask questions. I'm also not quite getting across to you, Rod. I'm going to pick up on something you were saying, Joe, and then I'll come across to you if that's okay, Rod. But if people have questions, if you type them in, then Nisha can let us know and we will answer them. Equally, if you guys have questions, we'll come to you in just a second. I had a really good question for you. Again, off the back of what you were saying, Joe.
Size 50 centimetre chest.
It was about contingency. It was about, so the idea that kind of when we're producing anything creative, we give the impression of quite a high level of control over it, higher than we perhaps have. And actually the way it develops is inflected by things we can't control often. So that you guys didn't know the measurement. The one I was thinking of was actually these curtains. The original use with a single curtain at the end, specifically to screen the shop. Because we couldn't move the shop, we didn't want it to bleed into the space. So but for me, there's a really interesting story there in terms of that then actually becomes the the visually dominant element in the space is a kind of a progressive creative response to a really sort of quite practical problem. And to what extent that's a part of your kind of experience of processes?
Very much so. Another good example of that is at Kingston during the pandemic. I did a performance in the gallery, and only a certain number of people were allowed in the gallery at any one time. We had performers and we had a camera crew again. So the entire choreography of the performance was utterly dominated by COVID rules, which could sound sort of exhausting and bland, but I hope I managed to sort of it actually enriched it in some ways. So there was a lot of coming and going from inside and outside the gallery. Audience members were allowed in, so there was this kind of dance from inside and outside, which sort of thematically was relevant.
If ever there was an era to celebrate contingency, the last 18 months have been it, right?
Absolutely. It's been one long good process.
So, Rod, can I ask you how you felt that this kind of process of collaboration has impacted? And then I think we will see if there are questions, and if not, repeat.
I'll just go back on that last one for a moment. I was really struck by the way during the performance the audience were wearing masks and how that made them feel strangely part of the costumed performers who also had masks, and how interesting that was. And I was taking photographs, so I kind of found these images with these masked people in the background of the pictures I was taking, and that was actually added a great deal. In terms of the question,
before I'm going to come to that question as well. The photography is actually a really interesting part of this process. Is that Rod has written, but also a significant number of the photographs documenting the project, both in 2018 and 2020, are Rod's, which again is it was more or less contingent. I presume that became something that was a part of the process, but I didn't know you were a photographer at the time. We were in contact with Ben.
I'm an outsider photographer, as I say, no training, but it is an important part of my creative practice. But not something that has been so much to produce images for exhibition or anything like that, but for me to be able to focus my limited visual perception. So that's how I've used it generally. But I found, in terms of thinking about what remains from such an ephemeral moment, for me, just looking at the photographs, that is a tantalising thing, a glimpse of something that has happened, which, I found that was interesting. I have been interested for some time in the question of non-linear storytelling. So how, if this has a value, and it's obviously very current with the whole question of video games and things like this, but with a novel you control the entire narrative, but when you give over some of the narrative to the audience, what happens? So with this question, particularly as Ben mentioned, the idea of recreating the world building we've done previously, but to bring division within this group, we have the question of how do we want to give it a happy ending, or do we want to give it a sad ending? Are these people going to end up together, or are they going to end up separate? And based on this idea of wanting to leave a puzzle rather than an answer, a lot of the writing I did was little vignettes. I like working with the form of the 100-word story, and so a series of 100-word vignettes that people could encounter in any order. And so that's been part of a kind of an interest of mine in the past, and it's something I want to carry on and take forwards. And it hasn't reached some sort of form at the moment, but it's definitely been pepped up by the experience of working with Ben on this. And yeah, kind of, I think that's, in terms of my practice, that's the kind of tangible outcome I could point to.
Well, both really tangible outcomes. I was expecting something fairly abstract and high level. But
it's like, no, we're working on it.
This project.
Yeah, next week.
Can I ask, do you guys have any questions at this point?
One question, and that is for Ben. How, as your role, do you steer? Do you challenge what your collaborators are doing, or are you pushing them in any particular direction, or do you allow it to evolve? I'm interested in that thought process of how that gets to that bit in a collaboration, because obviously, fundamentally, you're the charge, and what they do has got to reflect on what you want, or I'm not sure.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I think it's a bit of all of those things, actually. You know, I think it's a bit of me. I don't know if I'd use the word steering, but it's a bit of me suggesting things or nudging in a particular direction. It's also very much a responsive thing. It's a reflexive thing. It's also me responding to what's said. You know, it's a dialogical thing. It's a conversation as well. You know, so something that Rod or Joe say to me makes me think and changes the way I think about something, and I might say something back, and you know, it's an exchange of ideas, really. In its purest form, I think. But the flip side of that is, I suppose, you know, if something was produced that I didn't think quite fitted, then I'd say it in a way that I hope is not offensive, and think and just sort of think, okay, well maybe that didn't quite work, but what about this? Or you know, what? Let's try that instead. Or, you know.
I think my experience of that is doing drawings. So I remember, like, the first time we met, doing loads of drawings and kind of going, there's 10 people dancing around this pole and they're all covered in red, and like, you know, and I'd be kind of like, and I'd be like, yes, be like, yeah, this is going to happen, and this and I'd think like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen, and then I'd be like, yeah, have you got anything else? like, oh, you know, okay, yeah, any other drawings? Like, I don't know. And he's kind of like, so you know, because he wouldn't maybe acknowledge that as the magic moment. So you kind of, it might be your magic moment, but might not be his magic moment. And so you find, so I remember like doing lots of drawings and kind of showing them and waiting to feel a response, and waiting to, then if there wasn't a response or it didn't feel like anything happened at that moment, going, okay, that's fine, that design process is meant to stop for a bit. When we meet again, we'll reintroduce a conversation, and then we'll design later. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of like, I think there's definitely, you know what you don't want, mm-hmm. and you kind of, you're happy for it to not get resolved in that one moment, mm-hmm. and that it might be designed in 6 months' time if we didn't have the right thing then. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, I kind of definitely, you don't say that's right or wrong, but you do give some kind of cues. Master of ambiguity. Yeah, the master of ambiguity. Yes, you know when he's, he'll be like, yeah, that's, yeah. There's definitely something that, the ambiguous dialogue that happens, like the unsaid and the said. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it gets steered through the natural process of the conversation.
Yeah.
Anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Master of ambiguity is a great title, by the way, for you. A similar experience. I think a lot of our conversations were very conceptual, very abstract, and there we could go anywhere. But when we came down to the practicalities of a piece of writing or whatever, then you give a nudge one way or another. But you know, so I think there were two sides: the free-ranging philosophical discussion.
Yeah, it was very conceptual.
Yeah.
And also this thing of like, when we started our discussion, it was like, right, I've been speaking to Hugo, we're going to have someone strapped to the ceiling, they're going to come down, and then they're going to be in this harness.
To hang someone from a ceiling?
Yeah, and I was like thinking, right, let's start designing, this thing comes down and then that goes up, and so, but what's really interesting is the flexibility you've got to have, because it will be like, okay, we found out that a harness will not be able to be suspended because the ceiling won't, and so you get some practical stuff, and then you'll go, right, how do you're tendering between lots of factors, aren't you? It feels like, and some of it's kind of what, you know, the relationship between you and Hugo, and then your relationship back to us. And I like the fact that we go all out and go, what is the most extreme thing we can do?
Yeah.
And then and it goes through this whole I sometimes feel like we've been through 1,000 design processes before we get to the end. I feel like there's this massive stuff that happens that nobody sees, that's almost happened over a couple of years. You know, very open.
And I think that stuff has great value.
Yeah.
I think, I said to you before, I think those conversations are part of the artwork. They are an artwork in themselves. They have an extraordinary potency, and it's not, you don't see that necessarily. You see the evidences of it, but yeah, I wish we could have captured that sort of documented. It would probably have ruined it.
No, I've always thought that it's an artwork in itself.
Talking to Ben.
Yeah.
Those interactions.
And how, but you were talking about one time making like some kind of sort of conceptual website that showed those conversations, those weird links and fragments, and it was very hard. That would have been a real hard thing to construct, and even videoing the conversations and having them layered on top of each other. But the conversations are a massive part of the artwork and how they get navigated.
So I think for me there's something which we've talked about before, Ben, and I'm genuinely really interested in this idea of kind of like the community that exists around, particularly around performance, and the kind of, so we've done some work with Monster Chetwynd in the past, and the kind of the truth that exists around her, you know, that's absolutely a part of her process and her working practice. And I think we think about it as remaining invisible because it isn't necessarily shared. So with the conversations that you guys have had, conversations I've really enjoyed with you, conversations that have taken place between your kind of like Roma and Joe, who worked together through this for the first time, you know, this is all a part of practice. But what it seems to me to relate back to is this idea of performance as a moment of exclusivity. And you can transcribe those conversations, but you'd lose a lot through that process. And actually there's you and Ben there, or there's the three of you, or you, Roma and Ben. And somehow the existence of that is kind of enough.
Yeah.
That's of enormous value. And I think kind of as a culture of kind of artistic consumption, we have a tendency really to focus on product at the far end of it, and not you, Ben, I mean kind of like, but as a sector, and not think about that journey as part of the product. And I think that kind of the terminology of like an artwork or kind of a piece isn't super helpful in thinking about it. It's a project, and it's a project which is valued through a set of values we kind of associate with visual arts, I guess, and beyond that. But actually, all of those moments are a part of the process and the project. Whether it's, I think something within, you know, rather than being kind of standalone, so absolutely a part of that kind of the process and the artwork. But I don't think they need to be captured or shared to make them a part of that process.
And they necessarily can't, because they're disparate and they're happening, you know. That idea of the quality of the work, what is the work itself?
Yeah.
You know, thinking about the legacy of the work, or conversations or ideas being generated, which happens, you know, that's the essence of all art, isn't it, really? It's about a sort of a sparking of a conversation or a set of ideas. And those are numerous and different by definition, aren't they, and disparate. So they can't all be experienced, I think.
And process. That thing of like, you might be making an artwork, nobody sees the 3,000 processes you go through to get the finished piece. So that is almost your process, isn't it? Yeah. And I saw a triangle the other day on social media that said like, there's the life of an artist, like, you know, artworks made, artwork seen, and it had a little line across the top of it where it's like the tip of the triangle's the bit that's seen, and that's probably the same as like process versus final product. You know, there's been all of this stuff which we know is so important, but I know people have tried to capture process with head cams, and they look at it at the end and go, this is not that great, or but it felt really important to capture it, but only the end product really is relevant in the end. But it depends, isn't it? But I find the coffee shop conversation is important as an intense conversation online, or it's all relationship building, isn't it? Like it's all about relationships. Yeah.
I think that genuinely makes for a really good end point for what's been a fascinating conversation. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone online for coming and joining us. To our small studio audience, thank you very much for being here this evening. To Nisha for managing the tech, which I think seems to have gone fairly smoothly, though if we get lots of messages saying no one saw anything, we know it didn't, but it looks like it was good. And a huge thank you to Ben, Joe and Rod for being in conversation with me this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating and really insightful, both in terms of the exhibition and your practice, Ben, but I think also your practices as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hugo.
Thanks, guys. Massive thank you to you, Hugo.
Oh, thank you. Shall we turn it off now?